All right, so you guys wanted us to take a deep dive into this police shooting over in Gwangju. So let's break it down. It all went down early morning. Dark alley. Two officers responding to a call. There's a man chasing women. And the tension, you can just feel it right from the source material. They encounter the suspect, and things escalate pretty quickly. Ends up shot and killed. But the real question isn't, did the officers shoot and kill this guy? It's about whether or not they were actually justified in doing that.
Right. Was it self-defense?
Oh.
Or is there something else going on? That's what we're going to look at today.
And to do that, we have to look at the lead up to the shooting, what happened before those fatal shots. You'll see in the source material that the officers didn't just immediately open fire. They tried to de-escalate.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They used a taser, but it didn't work. It seems like the suspect was wearing really thick winter clothes, so the taser didn't actually connect. They even fired a blank round as a warning. That's a pretty clear sign they weren't going straight for lethal force.
So how does Korean law handle situations like this? I mean, it can't be shoot first, ask questions later, right?
No, not at all. Korean police, they have this 5-stage threat assessment system. It dictates how they respond to a suspect. It all depends on how much of a threat they seem to be.
I mean, break that down for us. What's this 5-stage system all about?
Well, each stage, it's a different level of threat. And it tells the officer how much force they're allowed to use. It starts with compliance. That means the suspect is cooperating. And then it goes all the way up to lethal attack. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, the officer's life is in immediate danger.
And in this case, in Gwangju, the source material suggests that things went from, 0 to lethal attack really quickly. The suspect didn't just, stand there. He charged at the officers, and he even injured one of them with his knife, face and neck.
Yeah, that injury, that changes things legally.
Yeah.
These officers, they're trained to protect themselves and everyone around them. At that point, it wasn't just a potential threat. It was a real and present danger.
Some law enforcement experts, they were quoted in the source material saying the officers had no choice. They had to defend themselves. They talked about how fast everything happened, how it went from just tense to life or death in a second. That suspect was a real danger to anyone in that alley.
Yeah, and it's interesting to compare this to police shootings in other countries, like the U.S., for example.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of Western countries, there's not as much debate about police using firearms, especially when they're facing someone with a weapon.
That's true. But this source also brings up a different viewpoint from Korea. There's this concern that if we second-guess self-defense, even in cases like this one that seems so clear-cut, it could make officers hesitate.
And that hesitation, that could have some pretty serious consequences. If officers are too worried about getting in trouble, they might not act when they need to. And that puts them and the public at risk.
So it's like a no-win situation.
Pretty much. It shows how tough policing is. You have to protect the officers, but you also have to make sure they're using force responsibly.
It gets even more complex when you think about that other incident mentioned in the source, the one where the suspect died after being tased, also in Gwangju. That case is still being debated. And it makes people wonder about how police actions are going to be scrutinized going forward.
It really raises the question of how much scrutiny is too much. Like, at what point does it stop officers from doing their jobs and keeping people safe? And maybe even more importantly, does that change depending on what weapon's involved?
Now, there's a question for you all. Where do you stand on all this? It's easy to judge the police, but cases like this, when you have all the details, it makes you think about how complicated this really is.
We've given you the background, the context, all the different perspectives. As we go deeper, keep this in mind. What stands out to you? What details are the most important when you're trying to figure out if this shooting was justified? Think about it.
This whole thing, it's not so black and white, It's tricky. You have to protect officers, but also make sure they're not just using force whenever they want.
It is. And this case in Gwangju really shows how tricky it can be, especially because we're talking about a knife here, not a gun.
And that is a big difference. The source material even brings up this question. What if this guy had a gun instead of a knife? Would that change how we see this whole self-defense thing? Would it change if the use of force was justified or not?
That's a good question. Would there even be this debate if he had fired at the officers? I mean, think about it. Would everyone just automatically side with the police if he had a gun?
It's like the type of weapon changes how dangerous we think it is, both for the officers and for everyone else.
It's true. It's like we automatically think a gun is more dangerous, even though a knife can be just as deadly if you're close enough.
It makes you wonder, Do we have this, like, ranking of weapons in our heads and guns are at the top? Like, if someone has a gun, we think the police can just use as much force as they want.
You're right. We focus on the gun. And sometimes we forget that other weapons can be just as dangerous.
And this case really makes us think about that. I mean, he was attacking them, he had a knife, he hurt one of the officers pretty bad. But we're still arguing about whether it was okay to shoot him. It makes you think about how we decide what's dangerous and how that affects how we judge what the police do.
And that's a big part of what we're trying to do in this deep dive. It's not just about what happened in Gwangju. It's about how we as a society decide when it's okay to use force.
It's like this case is showing us that we have this blind spot. We see a gun and we automatically think it's super dangerous. But sometimes we don't see the real danger right in front of us, like a guy with a knife who's already attacking.
Exactly. And because of that blind spot, we might judge the police differently depending on what kind of weapon they're facing.
So as we keep talking about this case, we need to ask ourselves, are we really being objective? Or are we letting our ideas about guns affect how we see things?
That's the question, isn't it? It's important for all of us to think about. But it's especially important for law enforcement. We expect them to make these huge decisions in a split second. But then we also hold them accountable for every little thing they do.
Right. Back to that balancing act. It's not enough to just give officers guns and training. We need to give them clear rules. We need to support them. And we need to have a system that's fair when we judge what they do in these crazy situations.
And that system has to be based on facts and logic.
Yeah.
And a real understanding of the danger, no matter what weapon is being used. We can't let our fear of guns control how we see every threat.
That's so true. We shouldn't be judging based on what we assume or what scares us. We need to look at the facts, what actually happened.
Exactly. That means we need to be informed, we need to think critically, and we need to be willing to question what we think we know.
So let's keep going with this deep dive. Let's keep our minds open. Let's not just assume things because of the weapon involved.
Let's look at what really happened.
Yeah.
What led up to this? What are the laws? And hopefully we can get a better understanding of this whole thing in Gwangju and what it tells us about self-defense and using force.
You know, it's a weird situation, right? We ask these officers to make these split-second decisions, like life or death stuff, but then we look at everything they did under a microscope. It's tough.
Yeah, it is. And this case in Gwangju, it really shows that. You have these officers, they're in a dangerous situation, the suspect has a weapon, and he's not afraid to use it. They have to assess the threat, try to calm things down if they can. But they also have to protect themselves and the people around them.
And in this case, they ended up using lethal force. And the source material, it shows both sides of the argument. Some experts say the officers did the right thing, they were in danger, the suspect had already hurt one of them, but then you have other people saying that maybe they could have done something different, that maybe they shouldn't have shot him.
It's that back and forth. That's what makes this case so interesting. It's not about saying who's right and who's wrong. It's about understanding how complicated this is, the pressure these officers are under, and how serious their decisions are.
You mentioned the laws in Korea about use of force. Is there anything different about how Korea handles these things?
Well, one thing that stands out is how much they focus on using the right amount of force.
Yeah.
Like, the officer's response has to match the level of threat. They can't just use as much force as they want. They have to be able to explain why they did what they did.
So they're going to look really closely at what happened in Gwangju. They'll see how the suspect was acting, what the officers did to try and calm things down, how the suspect attacked, the injuries, all of that to decide if shooting him was really the only option.
Exactly.
It's a lot to think about legally, ethically. Like we said, this is about more than just this one case. It's about how we think about the police, what it means to defend yourself, and how we keep people safe, but also hold people accountable.
And for you listening, this deep dive, it's a chance for you to think about all of this too. We've gone through the facts, the background, the laws, what people are saying. Now it's up to you to decide what you think about this case.
We always say you should do your own research. Go back to the source material, see what you find. Maybe you'll agree with the experts who say this was self-defense. Maybe you'll think the officers could have done something else.
There's no right answer. The important thing is that you look at the information, think about it, and come to your own conclusion.
And this isn't the end of the conversation. These kinds of cases are always going to be controversial. They make us question what we believe about the use of force. It's something we have to keep talking about.
So as you go about your day, keep thinking about these questions. What does it mean to use force and be justified? Where's the line between protecting officers and making sure they're doing the right thing? How do we figure all of this out in a way that's fair to everyone involved?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new. and that this makes you think. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep learning.